Welcome, everyone, to your Sioux Falls Council's operational. How about informational meeting? Operation wouldn't be bad either sometimes. Informational meeting. Today is the 18th of April, and we're here in Carnegie Hall with a few people that are here also, so thank you for being here. Appreciate it very much, and all that you are watching at home. Let's start with some open discussion. City Council. Yes, Councilor Kiley.
I think it's worth mentioning again, and I'll certainly mention it again during our Land Use Committee meeting, but the next Annexation Task Force meeting has been rescheduled from next Tuesday to Wednesday, and I think Jim is at the 28th. I don't have my calendar here.
26th.
26th, so Wednesday the 26th. It had originally been scheduled on the 25th at 2 o'clock at the library. That has now been canceled and moved to the next day, Wednesday the 26th. It'll be held right here in Carnegie Town Hall, right here in the chambers, and it begins at 5:30 to 7. 5:30 to 7. And the advantage is obviously we'll have microphones, so people will be able to hear us better. We have an overflow room if we need it. We'll also be able to record the meeting, broadcast at web stream, as well as TV, and then replay as well too. So there's a lot of advantages of that. But I'll mention it again at our land use, but I just want to make sure we get the information out.
I think it would be also good to mention it during our regular council meeting also.
Oh, sure.
Because a lot of people watch that don't watch this or the land use committee.
Sure, we'll determine the appropriate time to do that.
I would think that would be good. Yes, Councilor Staley.
I guess I got a question on that. How many people can fit in this room?
We were told that it would be in excess of 200 people. That would be not all seated, some standing room. So it would actually be able to accommodate more than what we had last Tuesday. In
this room?
Yes, this room. And that doesn't even count the overflow room.
Nothing else then? We'll move on to our agenda. Director Turbach, our financial reports for the month of March. 1 quarter in.
We are 1 quarter in. Good afternoon. Tracy Turbach with the Finance Office. I'm going to start out this afternoon with a request of all of you that I know the excitement level is pretty high. First financial presentation of the year. But I want you to pace yourselves a little bit and save some of your enthusiasm and excitement for the next presentation on subdivision ordinance standards. So save a little bit for that one. All right, today I will go through the economic indicators and the general fund overview on revenues and expenditures through the first 3 months of this year. And then I've also added a couple slides with some discussion points on sales tax revenues, and I want to talk a little bit about kind of how that's progressing, how we're managing our slower sales tax revenues this year. So getting started, unemployment, we have starting out the year just slightly higher than where we were a year ago. February is the latest data that we have that indicated that the Sioux Falls MSA had an unemployment rate of 2.9%. It's about 0.2% higher than a year ago, comparing with the state rate of 3.4% in February and the national rate of 4.9%. So again, unemployment continues to be very low and employment consequently very strong. Building permits, we are off with another strong start this year. Not quite the pace we saw last year or the year before, but we're at about 70% of the first 3 months of last year. 2017, the first quarter, we saw over $135 million of building permits issued. And I'm sure you're aware there are some big projects coming, some recent announcements and so forth that will be moving forward in the months to come, so we'll look forward to that. Sales tax, our general sales tax, this is the cumulative 12-month rolling growth rate, so it depicts month by month how much taxes have grown over the past 12 months relative to the prior 12 months. So through March of 2017, for the past year, we've been growing at 2.5%. And as you can see in the graphic, 1 year ago we were growing at about 4.9%. So that trend has continued to decline. The last 3 months have stayed steady at 2.5%. And just as a reminder for you folks, the 2017 city budget, the general fund budget, was based on a growth rate of 4% for 2016 and 4% for 2017. So that 2.5% growth rate obviously is not where we'd like it to be. Looking at entertainment tax collections, this too is a 12-month rolling growth rate. You can see that through March of 17 for the past year, we've grown at 3.7%. We like to think of this and consider this to be an indicator of discretionary spending within the local economy. 1 year ago, we were growing at 7.8%, so we've seen that taper off considerably as well, although it's been holding fairly steady for the last 6 or 7 months or so, right around that 4% growth rate, which is still indicates a fairly decent rate of growth in terms of the discretionary dollars rolling around in our local economy. Looking now at the general fund, year-to-date revenues and expenditures. Revenues, year-to-date, we've got about $24.2 million, which is 15% of our budgeted revenues for the year, and that is a consistent share of the budget that we saw in 16 and in 15 as well. The first quarter of last year saw revenues of $22.5 million. And obviously the one notable concern on the general fund revenue side is the sluggish growth in sales tax revenues. Looking at the expenditures, year to date, we've expended $32.4 million. That's about 20% of budgeted expenditures, and that is ahead of last year in 2015 by 1 or 2 percentage points. So we're seeing that spending percentage rate a little bit higher. That's primarily due this month due to the fact that we had 3 city payrolls in March, so we captured a third payroll in March. Last year, that first extra payroll occurred in April, so that will tend to even itself out by next month. The city has payrolls 26 times a year, so throughout the year there are 2 months where we end up with three payrolls in that month, and that happened to be in March of 17. So at this time last year, we did start to talk about the slowing growth rate in sales tax revenues. And as you saw on the earlier slide, and as I mentioned, that trend has continued. The growth rate has continued to slow. We are still seeing growth, albeit not at the rate we certainly would like to see. And 1 year ago, we did begin to respond in a measured way, managing expenses every day throughout the last 3 quarters of 2016. Our 12 departments really did what I think is a phenomenal job of managing their expenses throughout those final 3 quarters of last year. As a result, we ended 2016 about 4.2% under budget in the general fund, which is about $6.7 million. That's considerably more remaining in the budget than what we would typically see in an average year. As a result, the efforts from our departments, we did end 2016 with general fund reserves at 26.5%, just modestly above the 25% policy target. Again, that certainly wasn't easy, and it did take a lot of hard work on our department's part for each one of them to manage through that and identify those opportunities to reduce their expenditures. But one thing I will say, it was accomplished without taking our focus off of our priorities, and that was really, I think, true across the board. All of our departments tended to stick to their priorities as we managed through spending in 2016. Priorities like keeping our residents safe here in Sioux Falls, investing in priority infrastructure projects. They are all continually evaluating their service levels and how they might improve the effectiveness or efficiency of service levels. And of course, one priority that we should always have is maintaining the city's strong financial condition. And these priorities didn't change when it came time to develop the 2017 budget. Slower growth in sales tax revenues, however, was certainly a predominant factor in developing the 2017 budget, as you folks know. So this year we continue to manage, just as we did last year, manage our spending with those sales tax growth rates running below what was anticipated. As I mentioned, the 2017 budget was based on 4% growth in 16 and 4% growth in 17. So to put that current or most recent 2.5% growth rate into terms of dollars, if that rate continues for the remainder of 2017, we would miss our sales tax revenue budget by about $1.2 million. If that rate fell to zero and we actually saw no growth at all by the end of the year, that would represent a shortfall in budgeted revenues of about $2.7 million. So that kind of helps put that shortfall into perspective, keeping in mind the general fund budget is about $159 million. So how are we responding to slower growth in sales tax revenues? We monitor revenues and expenses very carefully. We do that every day anyway, but I think everyone is certainly, their sensitivity and awareness is heightened because of the sluggish sales tax growth. We monitor, evaluate, and plan, and then do it all over again as additional information becomes available. So with that growth rate in sales tax revenues slowing below what it was a year ago, the measured approach that we took last year, or that we started last year, has become more aggressive, but certainly not to the point of being drastic measures. Even before 2017 began, each department understood the importance coming into this year of identifying opportunities to save money on expenses in 2017. They understood the importance of becoming more efficient and rethinking how they achieve their mission. They understood how important it was to clearly understand the priorities within their own department. Again, I think their awareness level probably hasn't been higher in terms of what their own priorities are, and that certainly helps when it comes to reducing spending in those lower priority areas. Other revenues certainly play a part in this as well. Sales tax, of course, isn't our only revenue. We typically have very little ability to manage our revenues, but it's certainly a key that we do monitor and pay attention to how other revenue sources are coming in to help with this management process. Certainly if we have overruns in other areas that can help fill that gap in sales tax revenues, that certainly is a positive. Any underruns in other areas just tend to widen that overall revenue gap. So that's a key element, particularly in the general fund. Last is the resource of our general fund reserves, of course. That is a resource to be managed, and we continue to manage and to that 25% policy target, and that continues to be our goal, to finish the year at that 25% reserve level. So managing expenses in 2016 certainly wasn't easy, but the impacts on our highest priorities were far from severe. Managing expenses this year in 2017 has become more challenging, the decisions becoming more difficult as we move forward. They will become even more difficult throughout this year, and unless trends change, I expect the 2018 budget will prove to be very challenging as well. I do want to take just a minute and walk you through this slide. This is a comparison of the 2016 budget with the 2017 budget. So, and it's broken down by a half a dozen or so categories within the general fund budget. And you can see the pie chart on the right reflects that wages and benefits are the lion's share of the general fund budget. Two-thirds of our general fund budget is made up of employee wages and benefits. And you can see when we compare 16 to 17, the bottom line didn't change. The total budget was really flat. I think it was up a grand total of about $7,000 on a $159 million budget. And you can see almost all the categories other than wages and benefits were reduced. None of them saw meaningful increases really other than wages and benefits. It increased $3.7 million. So every new dollar in effect of revenue that we had went into funding our employee wages and benefits. In 2017, again, that was really the only area, the wages and benefits was the only area that saw meaningful increase. Most every other area was reduced below the 2016 levels. In 2018, looking ahead to developing the next year's budget then, this picture is likely to look very much the same. Wages and benefits, I expect, will be increasing. We know that, even if no new positions are added, we know that we will see increases in COLAs and benefits going forward. Most, maybe all of our other categories of expenditures within the general fund will very likely look like this graphic here, either decreasing or at best maybe flat. So this is all kind of intended to set the stage a little bit. We've got budget process that's beginning today internally, and we'll be carrying on in the months to come, and soon won't be long, we'll be before you folks presenting the 2018 budget. And it's important, I think, for you folks to understand just kind of where we've been through 16, kind of how we're managing through 17, and again, I think we all need to be appreciative of just how difficult some of these budgetary decisions are going to be, and how critically important it is that we continue to focus on our priorities. And in effect, I like to say that as a city, we need to stay in our lanes and make sure that we're doing what we are obligated to do and what we are intended to do, and do that as well as we can, and stay focused on those priorities. There's simply, every indication today anyway, is that there simply won't be dollars to fund everything that we might like to fund. And I suppose that's maybe always the case, but it's certainly going to be as true as it's ever been as we put the 2018 budget together. So, not to be gloom and doom, I just want to be very matter of fact and upfront with you folks about kind of where we are today. The city continues to be in very good financial condition, and certainly from my perspective, I intend to do everything I can to make sure we stay there. So, thank you, and Council will take any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Director. Questions? Councilor Erpenbach?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Turbeck. More of a philosophical question. I don't want anybody to run off and say, oh, Councilor Erpenbach wants to tax and spend, but, and it's a question for my colleagues as well. Philosophically, let's look at that 25% policy. You know, if tax collections dropping as much as they aren't a reason to dip into that 25%, which we're trying really hard not to, when would be? In just, again, philosophically, what would be a reason to dip into that 25%?
That's an excellent question, and I think the answer is probably different for each one of us. Certainly, what we've seen in the past, in the case of some sort of natural disaster or something, whether it's a ice storm, a flood, a tornado, whatever that might be, I think that's the easy go-to reason for why we might want to use some of our reserve funds. Beyond that, I think, for bridging some slow revenue growth period is certainly an appropriate use of reserve funds. If it's a temporary slowdown, it's never possible to predict exactly what's going to happen with revenues in the future. We've seen sales tax revenues actually decline at times in the past, year over year, and we're not there yet. I think we have to be very deliberate, very cautious about intentionally drawing reserves below that target level. Things, frankly, are not bad today. 2.5% growth is not bad. It's not great, But my gosh, things can get a lot tougher, and I think we have to be prepared for that. If we begin to dip into it when things just are getting uncomfortable for us, what are we going to do if that's depleted and things get really tough? So it's really a gut check, a judgment call, and I think it's something that we just have to take it one day at a time and measure just how desperately we need to use those dollars before we do that.
Well, I think that's a prudent answer. When we think about it is, I mean, I'd invite my colleagues to think about it and maybe answer now as well, but we have to know from each of us individually and from this group and from the administration, where's the line in the sand? And, let's look back a couple of years to, 4 years ago now, the ice storm that we all remember so fondly. We finished that year with the 25% reserve fund. We still did just fine, but that was a much stronger year in terms of sales tax growth than this year. So, yeah, point well taken. And again, just throwing it out there, just because I think it's one of those things that if you're going to lead a community, you have to know where that line is for yourself. And then we kind of need to know that as a group as well. So I appreciate your response.
Thank you. Other questions? Councilor Staley? Go ahead.
I've got a few questions.
Okay.
First question, we were told a while back that the department heads were going to be asked to cut back by 5%. Has that been completed?
I don't believe anybody told you, or at least nobody from my office would have told you that department heads were told they were going to have to cut back by 5%. I think maybe you've misunderstood. They were asked to put together a contingency plan to maybe accomplish that.
Right.
But there was certainly
And
no
he
direction
said, well,
that they
to
would
put
make
in
those
the
types of cuts.
the mayor said, put it up in the closet on a shelf, so to speak, so it would be used. So let me rephrase the question. Has what part of the 5% has been implemented in cuts?
We've identified spending management measures. I don't like to use the term cut. Budgets are still growing, or have grown year over year overall. So to me, that's not a budget cut. But they are finding savings, and we are currently managing based on that 2.5% growth in sales tax. So we've identified, I mentioned that 2.5%, if that continues for the full year, that would result in about $1.2 million shortfall in sales tax revenues. So that's what we're targeting today for that $1.2 million, managing to that 2.5% growth rate.
So you don't want to call them cuts. What's the word we want to use when we're asking the department heads to diminish the amount?
You can call them cuts if you want.
Okay,
That's just not
so
a term I use.
well, so just if we're talking with the public and we say, well, they've cut back by 2% now, and my question is, have we finished? When will we have finished asking everyone to cut back by 5%? And then if things don't get better, will we be doing another 2%? Or is this just going to be kind of a moving target where we do a little here, a little there?
The $1.2 million number relates to the 2.5% growth rate in our sales taxes. And so we've asked the departments, and they have identified $1.2 million in savings in this year's budget. And so that's what we're managing to today. That represents about 0.7% of the total general fund budget. So that's where we are today. A month from now, things may be different. We may have to go further into that 5% contingency plan that you're referring to.
Right, so we haven't gone in, so the question is, we haven't started the 5% contingency plan.
Well, we have to the extent of $1.2 million.
So what percentage did you say that was? 7%, 0.7%?
0.7%, 0.7%.
Of the 5% possibility.
Of the total general fund budget.
Another question. I know I brought this up with the park department when we heard about the cuts made in the summer singers and different musical things that have been offered in the past. Can we as a council get a copy from each department of the places where they have made cuts? Is that something we're privy to? Because I know in that one, you were showing us up there, you said they'd cut back in like utilities, and there's just different, if you put that thing up there, you were, yes. So can we see a breakout of actually what they've cut back on in each department?
And relative to this graphic, you have all this information. This is within that 2017 budget book. So these numbers came right out of that budget book.
But so like up to date of now, have we changed that from the budget book?
No, I mean, the budget is what it is. They are asked to implement or essentially avoid spending dollars to come up to that $1.2 million. That's where we are today.
Okay, then
In some cases, it's very easy to point to a particular program. You got a list of them from the Parks Department.
That's right.
Exactly what, it's not that simple in every case across, because not every department operates programs like Parks Department does. So we can't necessarily point and say, this is one thing that they're doing. An example, another change that's taking place as part of that $1.2 million in savings is with the street sweeping program. You maybe heard Mark Cotter talk about that for they sweep the streets in town several times a year. After the first time, they can manage and sweep just the gutter and the gutter pan. So they can get that whole program done and then street sweeping done without running as many street sweepers, and that translates to needing less staff time doing that, less equipment, and so those dollars are part of that $1.2 million.
Well, and I think it would be a very appreciated by the public if we could go back as council members and say, hey, Public Works Department was going to buy 10 brand new trucks, and because we've had this downturn in our growth, we've decided we're not going to buy those new trucks this year. So we can say there's a tangible thing we're doing to help deal with what's happening, but we are not cutting back on how many times we are going to remove snow from your street or sweep the streets. And people are kind of asking those questions, is what exactly are we doing to cut back? Where are these cuts happening? But okay, so the last thing I wanted to ask about was, and we're talking a lot about now annexation. We're talking with citizens, residents outside of Sioux Falls about what their property taxes are going to go up, because this would be an impact on them. And so we were talking about the operational budget and property taxes coming in. Tracy, if you could tell us, out of $100 on a property tax bill, what percentage goes to the city?
I guess I'd have to look at that to see how much is.
I believe it's around 15 to 17%. County gets about the same. The rest of it goes to the school district.
So
And that split changes a little bit every year. That's why I hesitate to give you an answer.
so you agree it's 15 to 17%?
That's a fair guess. I would have guessed a little higher than that, but
It's about 15, 17 for both county and state and city, and the rest of it goes to the school district.
We can
At least
certainly
that's
give you that
my
information.
remembrances from years past.
Okay, so $15 on a $100 bill goes to,
we can certainly get you more specific information on that.
thank you.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead. Councilor Starr?
Director Turbeck, thank you. One of the things that really stood out to me is we talked a little bit about month over month from 16 to 17 in March expenditures, and you said it was roughly 1 or 2%, and it is 2% according to the numbers that you presented as part of the financial report. But it's a significant amount of money. It's $4.23 million more that we spent in 17 than we did last year. I get the extra payroll, and that'll even out next month, but when I worked with our staff, we were talking with Mr. Bixler. We looked at some things. Obviously, there's going to be some aquatic center costs that weren't there in March of 16. It surprised me that highways and streets we spent $400,000 less in 17 than we did in 16. So that's probably more of a question for Director Cotter when we're done. But again, other than payroll, did anything stand out to you that was significant as I'm going through this list of things where we had some considerable spending increases in comparison to last year?
Yeah, the primary driver in that is that extra payroll. That is significant, and I apologize, I can't give you an exact dollar number on that either. But yeah, I'm looking at some of the other highlights, and there really isn't anything there relative to expenses that isn't related to that extra payroll.
Okay, because one of the things that stood out to me was the aquatic center. There's probably about $334,000 in extra expenses that we had when the pool wasn't open last year, obviously.
Right.
And some significant labor and playground things that were in parks, but, and the zoo professional agreement hit, according to this, in March rather than it had later at different times during last year. So that part did stand out, and then when we look at 60% of our budget being wages, I mean, that makes sense. Probably about 60% of that increase is in those categories. The other question that I had is we got some really great news, and I don't want to steal anyone's thunder today about some grant funding, but in the transit area, how is that, when we get an unexpected grant that's a significant amount of money, how does that affect the budget, or how do we move things around, or do we leave that in the transit budget to free up other dollars, or is it too early to?
Yeah, and I don't know that I have a really good answer for you. My answer with anything relative to transit is that we know that it's going to take more money to continue to run transit and to continue to replace buses on a timely fashion. So I would be very reticent to cut back on any dollars that we have already programmed in to transfer into that transit fund.
That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Seeing no other questions, Tracy, I have a couple for you. Just a note, we're working with the operations budget of the 159 million. We've got another 159 over here for capital, plus we got the property taxes, plus we got other income coming in. So the whole thing ends up being, what, 450 million, somewhere in there?
Give or take, yep.
When we get done with it. Yeah. And so just want to make sure that it does affect other things too, but they're probably a little easier to manipulate, if you will, or to cut back, whatever you want to call it. I want to thank you and the administration for being proactive in getting this plan ready. I hope it never has to be implemented. $1 million, if we, don't have $1 million at the end of the year, that'll be a fantastic year. But hopefully it'll be above that, and we've gained on the process as the economy continues to increase, and we have more and more employment, et cetera, in Sioux Falls. So again, thank you very much for being diligent and to keep that thing going. One of the things that I'm interested in, tell me whether I'm wrong or right, in looking at quarter over quarter last year from 16 to 17, it appears that quarter over quarter we've had about a 7.5% increase in income in sales tax or in general fund revenue. I just did a quick calculation of taking the 22 million minus the 24 million, dividing it out, it comes to about 7.5. Don't know whether that's unaudited, audited, or one of them is and one of them isn't. I'm not sure, but the 2.5 is probably going to level out more. That's the projection, because you're looking at it from hindsight, and this kind of says that things might be looking up a little bit in my book.
Well, there are, I would just caution you to, when you look at something like that, just there are a lot of timing differences. Yep. From 1 month to the next, or from 1 year to the next. When you're comparing a quarter, I can tell you that I think a big part of what you're noticing is a change in the way that we are reporting sales tax revenues on page 1 in your report. If you might recall, last year there was a lot of confusion because we report sales tax revenues in a couple different places in the report. On page 1, it essentially last year was being done on a cash flow basis. So if we had received the payment, it was reported as revenue. On page 3, where we report the general sales tax, capital improvement, entertainment tax, and lodging, we were looking at that on an accrual basis. And that's really, from my standpoint, that's the best, most reliable method of reporting those revenues. That is where you should be looking in terms of comparing one year to the next, because that removes those timing differences that you may have been noticing in the past. The change that we've made is on page 1 this year now. We've started reporting those on the same accrual basis as we are on page 3, and so that's an accounting change. It doesn't really improve or detract from anything, but it does, I think, improve the consistency within the report And going forward, it'll, when we make those types of comparisons that you're talking about, will be far more consistent.
Okay, thank you. That's a good explanation that way. I had one other question in here. I know what it was. With wages and salaries, benefits taking about 67% of that 159 million. I don't suppose with the huge salary that the council is getting, if we deferred for a month, it'd make a big difference, would it?
Hey, every bit helps
Okay, thank you.
if you're offering.
I couldn't pass it up. I'm sorry. Any other questions for Director Turback? Thank you very much.
Right, thank
Have
you.
a great day. Okay. Next presentation is subdivision ordinance standards project by Mr. Trubelcock.
Sam Trebelcock, City of Sioux Falls Planning Office. First of all, I appreciate Tracy's raising expectations on this presentation here. I don't know that I'm going to meet it, but I do think it's important for us to highlight the subdivision ordinance from time to time. As you know, I think what kind of the goal of the presentation, my goal for the presentation really is to help educate you a little bit about the subdivision ordinance. Describe the process that we're going to look at in terms of updating it, and then allow you some input and questions on this process. This is kind of the beginning of the process. The subdivision ordinance tends to be one of those things that's a little bit of a black box that you might imagine, that you're wondering what's going on in there. And it's important for us to take a look at what's going on in there, especially the subdivision ordinance standards. So I'm going to take you through that process a little bit. You guys deal with a lot of preliminary subdivision plans. That's a part of that process. So what we're doing is we're updating the subdivision ordinance standards and process. We're starting now with this meeting, and it'll be anticipated to go through the fall. So there'll be quite a bit of public involvement that we would expect to go through in this process, and then quite a bit of work with a number of stakeholders. Planning office will be facilitating the process. So if you're wondering who to talk to, you can talk to me or the planning office. The area that this covers is the city area, but it also covers the area, the joint area, the city-county platting and zoning jurisdictional area. So it's important to understand that. And that's something that's being updated even as we speak. That process you'll be voting on over the next few months. In fact, tonight you'll be asked to vote on the major street plan. The major street plan is the planning for the area of the streets that are within that joint area. So something to kind of tie into tonight's meeting a little bit also. Why are we doing it? Again, the subdivision ordinance was last updated in 2008. Mainly when we updated it then, we were dealing with the process. Trying to streamline it, trying to make it work better with, because it last was updated probably 15 years before that. So the standards weren't updated at that time, at least to a large degree they weren't updated. So we wanted to look at that at this time. And then we also wanted to see how that adoption process, the process that we were working at, how it's working now, and make some changes as we've been working on it, with it for the past 9 years. So what's the purpose of this subdivision ordinance? It's to regulate the subdivision of land, coordinate streets, roads, utilities, and other subdivisions. It's to coordinate with the zoning ordinance and engineering design standards, and I think that's really important. That's something we work really hard to do at the same time, is work within the zoning ordinance and do it concurrently. And the engineering design standards, that's a lot of the things that we interface with through the subdivision process. We're referring in large part, in many cases, to the engineering design standards. We want to make sure that it's consistent with some of our plans, including the Sioux Falls Comprehensive Plan. the long-range transportation plan, and then a fairly recently adopted complete street policy. That's something that we wanted to try to find as we adopted that complete street policy. One of the implementation items was to look at the subdivision ordinance and what kind of things could we do to enhance complete streets. Now, the subdivision regulation is typically the control of platting of undeveloped land into building lots. We're not typically dealing with areas that have already been developed. Although sometimes the subdivision ordinance also does deal with replatting and things of that nature. But typically the entire process is when it's being first developed. And it's important to note that no owner of any land shall transfer or sell any land before a subdivision plan has been approved and a plat has been approved or recorded. So that's a part of that process. And the preliminary subdivision plan is, again, what you guys see at City Council level and Planning Commission. So why are subdivisions so important? Once tracts are broken up into lots, development patterns are virtually locked in. So that's why it's important to do it right the first time. And you probably have noticed in some situations where maybe you don't feel like it was done very well years and years ago. Well, that's things that we want to try to fix as we are developing land into the future. Initial street system design has a long-term effect on neighborhood quality and traffic flow and sometimes even congestion. The width and configuration of streets must meet the requirements of emergency vehicles. There must be adequate supply for water, sewer, provision of sewers. These are all things that you look at in the subdivision process, in the platting process. Also to prevent downstream flooding, stormwater runoff, you're looking at that. And development cannot exceed the amount, runoff cannot exceed the amount prior to development. So each lot must be defined to avoid boundary disputes and title effects too. So those are things you're looking at, especially when you get to the plat process. Now, how does this work within the development review process? Of course, one of the first things that we do is annexation. That was talked about a little bit earlier. But typically, again, when we're dealing with the entire process, we're dealing with undeveloped land. So typically this would be on a petitioned annexation, a piece of land that's coming in for an agricultural piece, but not necessarily all the time. So what we're trying to do, again, and I'm trying to highlight with this graph here, is we're trying to do it concurrently with the zoning process. Not all the time does it necessarily have to happen, but when we're doing a preliminary subdivision plan, that goes to the Planning Commission and it goes to you at City Council. At the same time, we'll be going through the zoning process, the rezoning process. And then after that, there's some other steps that take place after that preliminary subdivision plan. But that's the big picture. That's the things that really set the street system and the lot and blocks and the things that you really, is really important that you get right that first time. After that, you have a development engineering plan, and there you're looking at finished grades, and you're looking at making sure that you're getting the infrastructure in the exact level that you need to. That's something that's done through standards. And that development engineering plan must meet the preliminary subdivision plan. It must be consistent with that. If it's not, it would come back for a major amendment to you. Then it goes to the plat, and typically the plat, there's maybe 4, 5, 6 or more individual lots that will come in and be platted into something that can be recorded to the county and then can be sold. So that process is important too, but it's done again through standards. It doesn't come back to you. So that's what we're talking about. It's important to review this every so often. Construction plans are reviewed. That's when engineering will look at specifics for roads being constructed. Right before they're constructed, they'll review them to make sure that they can take those roads, because the private developers developing those roads or that sewer and water, and then the city is going to need to take those and maintain those. So they want to make sure it's done to the standards that are set. So that kind of gives you an idea of the process that we're going through on the subdivision planning process. This is what you typically will see through your process, your review process is a preliminary plan, where you're looking at that lot and block layout. You also will see where the sewer and where the drainage is going to be. And it's, again, the most important part is making sure that lot and block layout is laid out appropriately and provides for traffic flow and access to the lots that are being looked at for development. So what are some of the things that we're looking at in terms of updating? And we're kind of in, again, early stages, but some of the things that we know that we need to start looking at, as I mentioned earlier, is the complete street standards. What kinds of things can we add here? Do we want to add? We want to start talking to stakeholders and the citizens about what is important here. Something else that's being looked at is low-impact development standards, or those things that we should bring into the standards for the subdivision process. Mixed-use development standards, that's something that we've been incorporating as part of our zoning ordinances. We did update it a little bit with the subdivision standards in 2008, but we need to revisit that and make sure that it's working properly. Other standards that we've looked at is things like lot access, flagpole lots. We've seen a lot of those lately. Traffic studies, how does that interface with the preliminary planning and the zoning process? Private streets, electronic submittals, that's something that's fairly recent. How is that being incorporated and working within the subdivision process? We want to make sure that process is consistent with the zoning process and also, of course, with state law. What does the public want? So we think that's something we want to try to engage the public with as a part of this process. Well, how are we looking to do that? What we're talking about right now and starting to set up is what we call a neighborhood street visual survey. The best way we think we can engage the public is do something that's visual. In this case, it would be the street system. Not that they might not have input in other places, and we can still allow for that, but at least engaging them in the things that they see and they live day to day through, which is the street system. So the idea here is the survey would be designed to gain input from the citizens when driving a car, riding a bike, walking. The survey information will be utilized to help update the subdivision ordinance. So part one would be, what street would you rather use? We're going to show pictures of 2 different streets. What kinds of input can we get from them? Then also part 2 would be, how likely or important are various street improvements for you? Trying to get at certain things like sidewalks and other improvements. How important is street width to them and things like that. The survey has 18 visual questions. It would only take about 10 minutes to complete. It would be something that would be available on the web through something like SurveyMonkey, which we have access to at the city. We would start the process through an open house, though, and give people the opportunity at that open house to take the survey. So the whole process and public involvement plan that we have laid out would start here and then go to the public open house early May. Right now, the thing we're talking about is maybe doing it before a city council meeting, in between informational and the city council meeting, allowing for people as they're coming in to interface with us and talk to us about it. And then when the neighborhood street visual survey would be open maybe for 10, 15 days after that, we get the word out to people through the media. And then after that, we would start looking at what types of input did we receive from the public, and then we would take it to what we call IRAB. A lot of you might know IRAB is Infrastructure Review Advisory Board. We think it would be the best stakeholder group to review this. A lot of them are developers, engineers, people that work with engineering, preliminary plans, and plats. And we would do that through the summer and work with them to see what kinds of changes we should be making. After that, we'd come back for a second public open house, talk about the things that we think should be changed and get people's input on that. Then go to Planning Commission, as required by state law, and then to City Council for approval. Stakeholders would be engineering and fire at some of the departments other than planning, IRAB, developers, surveys, consulting engineers, or certainly anybody else that's interested. With that, I would take any questions that you have.
Okay, questions? Councilor Staley?
Okay, a few questions. First of all, what's a flagpole lot?
Yeah, a flagpole lot would be, typically when you see a lot, it just has a fair amount of frontage along a street, and so it's pretty easy to get access. Sometimes a flagpole lot will develop when the pole would be very narrow with access. And you got to be careful about how narrow.
Boulevard area?
No, it would be,
You're talking about a pie-shaped lot
yeah, it would be, well,
where there'd be
see if
little,
I can show one here. I don't know that we have a flagpole lot here specifically.
But is there actually a flagpole in the lot?
Well, the pole is very narrow in terms of the frontage that it has on the street. Sometimes it's so narrow you can't even fit a driveway on it. And sometimes when you're doing that, the lot is behind another lot. So you have to be really careful when you allow those. And that's the kind of thing that we want. And we're starting to see some flagpole lots developing. And we want to.
Well, maybe you could get me like a picture of that, so to
Absolutely.
help me visual. Okay, one question.
Absolutely.
Second question, on these, do you ever use apartments? Are they ever included in this?
Are apartments ever utilized in this?
Right.
Well, I mean, when apartments are developing, they're going to have to plat off a piece of land to put their apartment on. And so that's part of
It's
this
good,
process.
right. So, and I remember there was a place up northeast of town where they were having an issue with two roads coming in, Canterbury Heights or something.
Oh, okay.
Is that, I was just wondering, I've driven through Hidden Hills a few times. What's the situation with that? That's a new apartments complex. There's only one road going in there.
Okay, so that'd be a perfect discussion for some of the standards that we would want to apply for the subdivision planning process. Because when that preliminary plan came in, it was set for a certain number of access points in and out, and how and when you develop those access points are part of that process. So yes, we would.
But they weren't
be open
mandated to
that.
have two access points into that huge apartment complex?
Well, I'm not familiar exactly with that particular apartment.
And
But-
they're still working on it, so I'm assuming somebody said it was okay just to have one driveway into that.
Depending on how many units they have, typically, I think it said that it's 30 units. It's when you have one in and out, but that varies, and that's something that we can certainly talk about and I can bring up.
Okay, then you said you're going to give people a choice of two streets, two pictures of
Yes.
streets. A nice. What would that be? How do you have two?
Well, one street might be a typical street that you would see in a subdivision with sidewalks on both sides, a boulevard. Another street might be a street without sidewalks or something like that. And just show them the difference between the two of them. Or another one might be a private street versus, another type of a street with a rural section street, things like that. It's tough to show or detail what that would be without showing you that, but that's some of the things that we're trying to.
Okay, so because now again we're talking about annexation, we're talking about existing areas that don't have sidewalks, and
Yep.
my understanding was anything new had to have a sidewalk. So
Yes.
you're making it sound like people would have a choice of maybe not having a sidewalk.
No, I'm not talking about that, although obviously if a
Said that,
huge number
maybe
of people wanted to do that, but we're not at all talking about doing that. That would have to be coming from a huge number of people saying that for some reason that this was beneficial. But I think some of the things that you have to keep in mind as we go through this process is there is ADA standards that we have as a city that we need to comply with, and that includes ingress and egress for pedestrians. And So we're not just using this tool to engage the public to set the table for everything that we do, but it does allow us an aspect to gain public involvement and get them thinking about it and gain their input.
Other questions? Councilor Erickson.
Thank you. And we're not talking about annexing in a neighborhood and then making those changes. We're talking about annexing raw land, correct?
Right.
That's what we're focusing on. And so in your instance, those neighborhoods are already there and don't have the sidewalks. And so that's a completely separate issue versus I have 40 acres, I'm going to subdivide, I want the streets here. This is what it looks like in that instance. Then we do discuss sidewalks and what it looks like.
Yeah, it's, getting it, when you're starting to talk about rural subdivisions that you're bringing in, all of this. Retrofitting infrastructure in rural subdivisions is a totally different thing.
Yeah.
It's just like different sides of the earth because of the way it was developed to begin with.
And then the last thing I want just to let you know is I sent you each a text with a flagpole lot that will show you what it looks like. So if you have questions, you can refer to that. All I did is Google flagpole lot, clicked on the images, and it brought up several examples. And so it's easy peasy to do, but I sent you each an example.
What flag was on the pole?
American flags.
Okay. Councilor Neitzer.
Could you just tell me why, on a policy basis, why flagpole lots are undesirable?
Well, not necessarily if they're done with a pole that would be wide enough for access. Is it all the time necessarily wrong? And that's why sometimes it's happening. But if the access is behind other lots, sometimes getting access to those lots is very difficult for emergency vehicles, for the public. It gets to be really confusing to address. So those kind of things you have to be really careful of, especially with residential lots. It does become a real problem, especially when that pole, that access point, becomes really long.
So are you just proposing that there just be an open discussion about whether to allow them or not, and if so, under what conditions? Just an open-ended discussion?
It's more about under what conditions. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councilor Erpenbach, I'm sorry, I did not see your...
No, that's okay. I'm just going back to the flagpole thing. It is not an actual flagpole. If you look at a map of lots in the City of Sioux Falls, you'll see some of them. If you look at it from the top, they have little narrow pieces that stick out. And actually, we did a couple of flagpole annexations in the time that I've been on this city council. One of them is out to McGovern Middle School, in that we annexed the road going out there, and then the flag is McGovern Middle School. And we've done the same kind of thing with the foundation park, in that there's a flagpole, and then the park is the flag. That's what a flagpole lot is. It's as seen from above. Just had to clear it up because the public didn't get the text. So thank you for doing that, though. I appreciate it, Councilor Erickson.
I have a couple of questions, and seeing no others. Let's see here. Look at this. Okay, that one. On your slide here, why are subdivision ordinances needed? And one of the examples you give is to prevent downstream flooding. Stormwater runoff development cannot exceed the amount prior to the development. How does that work when in a development you put cement, driveways, you put roads, and you put rooftops in there? The runoff has got to be more than what it was before. But you do that with I just thought of it, settlement pond that allows the runoff to go there, and then it's drained off in a more timely manner.
Yeah, there's a number of ways that it's looked at, but detention, retention ponds are typically a way that you'll look at it, or just natural drainage ways to help with that. But that's part of that subdivision review process, that preliminary plan. That some of the questions I think come up quite often, especially from the public, is how is this going to work? And that's something that we have to be able to respond to through these standards.
What is a low-impact development standard?
Well, in some cases, it can be a number of different things. Sometimes it could be simple as something as trying to find ways to be able to do rain gardens. to be able to limit stormwater runoff. Again, it gets into stormwater runoff. Sometimes cities have found ways that in some developments, can you reduce the width of the street, which is reduce the width of the pavement. That's, again, lower impact. But you have to measure that and balance that with emergency vehicle access and traffic.
Okay. The open house that you're going to have, that you want to have, where you're going to just, people are, as I understand it, you're going to have people just, you're going to announce it, and then people who want to show up are going to show up and look at these pictures and give you an idea of what that is. I have some concerns about that from a scientific standpoint of whether it would be a true, accurate reflection of what the citizens of Sioux Falls want. Because I can see there may be a group that would want to come in and say, you know, we're going to flood that one and we're going to do it. We're going to tell them exactly what we want rather than what the overall population of Sioux Falls. So I might caution you on that and have you take a look at maybe a more scientific way to find out what the actual citizenry of Sioux Falls wants rather than maybe a small select group.
And I think what's important is we're trying to engage the public and get them to understand what this is about. So that's kind of the first half of the survey. The second half, we'll get into a little bit more, I don't know if it would be scientific, but it would be more specifically on the issues about what do you think about this kind of issue, and get them to respond. And then I think it would be important also, and even as I'm listening to this, that we give them, you know, what kinds of things do you think are important for us to be changing, keeping, and just some open-ended questions too. And that open house will allow for that too. Just come in and let people talk. So.
Okay. I believe that's it.
One more question?
Yes.
Well, we're talking, the subdivision, when we're talking about a field that's going to be platted off and developed, those people don't really know they're going to live there yet, do they?
No.
So who are the people that are coming to this open house?
Well, it can be people that are interested in the way that the community is going to develop. Some of the things we've talked about, how interested are they in complete streets and being able to neighborhood connectivity and things like that. But certainly also that developers and engineers are going to be interested too, because they're the ones, and landowners are going to be interested.
So not
I think it's a
the
combination.
actual person living there?
Well,
probably not.
I think the public in general is going to be interested because it does certainly impact the way that they can travel and move from one part of the community to the other. So I think it's important, regardless how the new community develops. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Sam. Have a good afternoon.
Yep. Thank you.
I have a couple of things for notes for everybody. The April 21st informational and joint Minnehaha County meeting next week is canceled. The only meeting we will have is a joint Lincoln County, which is scheduled in Canton at 7 p.m. And that's for anybody who wants to travel down to Canton with us is very welcome to do so. Is there anything else for the good of the order? I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you.